All right, folks, I am going to get started. So, welcome back. I hope you guys enjoyed your well, not little. I mean, 20 minutes is a pretty decent amount of time, right, in between the class, right? That's what I want. I want you guys to kind of have like a nice little respite where you reboot, come back, take this on for at least one more hour, and then we'll call it a night. Any questions about anything before I continue on with the material? Anyone come up with a question while we were on break? Nope. Alrighty. Let's jump into chapter 3. So we've covered chapter 1, we've covered chapter 2. Now we're going to cover chapter 3. And again, like we're dealing with subjects that are sort of universal within economics, not necessarily specific to macroeconomics yet. We'll start on that next week. Next week we'll start talking about actual macro topics, which are ultimately my favorite topics in economics. So I'm going to really enjoy teaching this class. I haven't actually taught this course here yet. I've assisted in teaching macro before, but now I get to teach it myself, which I'm excited about. But anyway, chapter 3 is going to be about supply and demand. And although supply and demand can generally be thought of as like a very sort of micro topic, it's ultimately about understanding like a market model, because we are going to look at markets in macroeconomics, but the markets that we'll look at will be like macro markets. Like we'll look at all the demand in an economy versus all the supply in an economy. We'll also look at markets for like loans, like, a certain amount of people want to borrow money, a certain amount of people want to lend money, and they come together in a market and they set up a price for the loans, which is the interest rate, which winds up being like a really important variable in macroeconomics. So markets will play a role in this course, and so it's important to cover this basic chapter, much like it was important to cover like the model chapter, because again, even though a lot of the stuff we looked at was like very simple and could even just be thought of as kind of micro in scope, it does ultimately give us insights into what we do in macroeconomics, which is use models, and like it gives us insights into how we should be thinking about the models and how much of the workings of those models we should understand in order to truly understand the insights that we can gain from the models. So that's why we are studying these basic things at first, and that's why we're going to jump into supply and demand right now. So what you'll learn in this chapter, we'll talk about what a competitive market is, how it's described by the supply and demand model. We'll talk about what a demand curve is and what a supply curve is. We'll talk about the difference between movements along a curve versus shifts of the entire curve. We'll talk about how supply and demand curves determine a market's equilibrium price and quantity, right? Like the point at which the market's at rest, the point at which the price is what everybody's paying, and the amount that's being transacted is the best the market can do. We'll talk about what happens if there's a shortage or a surplus, and how price moves the market back to equilibrium when we're not in equilibrium. So let's start generally by talking about the model in very general terms. So a market, in general, is a place where buyers and sellers trade goods and services. All of us engage in market transactions all the time. Anytime we buy anything, we're engaging in a market transaction. We are on the demand side generally, but maybe you have been on the supply side. Maybe you have sold something. Maybe you've produced something and sold it. So you can potentially have been on both sides of a market. A competitive market is a very particular type of market. It has many buyers, it has many sellers of the same good or service, and none of these buyers or sellers have any influence on the price at which the good or service is sold. So you got to think about like a very generic good, like oil or wheat or steel, like things that like nobody can really like put their own special spin on. They can't, like in the burger market, call it a Big Mac versus a Whopper. Like it is steel, it is wheat. That's it. And because of that, and because everybody can, easily produce this stuff given like the right resources and the right access to those resources, it's easy for firms to be involved in those markets, and therefore it's very competitive. Nobody has like any leverage over the market. Nobody can say, well, I'm the biggest seller in the market, and therefore I'm going to charge a higher price than everybody else, and people are going to have to buy from me because I'm one of the only sellers. That's what happens in other markets. Like the other extreme case we consider in economics is the monopoly market, where you have one seller. That one seller controls the entire market, and that is the opposite case of a competitive market. And then you have imperfectly competitive markets, which are in between, which are generally the markets that all of us interact in. And in those markets, you'll have like a few sellers selling the good, and because there's a few of them, they still kind of have a lot of power collectively over the market, but not in the same way that a monopolist does. And then the other case is like called a monopolistically competitive market, in which there is competition like you would see in a competitive market, but whatever's being sold can kind of be made into like like an individual like special version of what's being sold. Like in the burger market, McDonald's can call their burger, a Big Mac, and Burger King can call their burger a Whopper. And even though they're basically bread and meat and some lettuce and tomato and some sauce, because they each were able to kind of put their own stamp on it, they can kind of say, well, this is my version of a burger, so I'm going to charge a slightly different price than you're going to charge. And so you have different versions of what a market could be, but here we're considering the most competitive extreme case. And so we're not thinking about the complexities that come along with the less competitive markets, of which there are many. And if you've taken micro, you've been exposed to that complexity. And that class is basically about that, about understanding the complexities of these various market settings. All right, so the supply and demand model is a model of how competitive markets behave. And so there's demand, there's supply, they come together, there's an equilibrium. And we'll talk about that now. But first, let's talk about one side of the market, the demand side of the market, the part that has to do with consumers buying things in the market. Now, that can be represented by the demand curve. So the demand curve comes from a demand schedule. And a schedule of demand is just a table showing how much of a good or service consumers are willing to buy at different prices. So like you see here, you've got a bunch of prices per pound of maybe meat or something. And as the price increases, we see that the quantity demanded goes from at a price of 0 from 120 to all the way to 0 when the price gets up to 6. So we see that those two variables, the quantity demanded and the price, move in opposite directions. And that reflects the law of demand, which is a very basic, intuitive thing that occurs in markets. The higher the price for a good or service, other things equal, ceteris paribus, leads people to demand a smaller quantity of that good or service. So that's just what the law of demand is. We're talking about the quantity demanded. That is the actual amount of a good or service consumers are willing to buy at a given price. So the information from the table can also be converted into a set of coordinates on the XY plane, the Cartesian plane that we're all familiar with from some math course that all of us took at some point in our lives. The information from the quantity demanded column, so this information here is going to be labeled on the x-axis, so the flat horizontal axis, while the information on the price column will be on the y-axis, the vertical axis, the one standing up. So here we are, the price of, in this case, we're talking about cotton. So here's the price of cotton, and here is the quantity of cotton demanded. And what we're going to see right now is the demand curve, a graphical representation of the demand schedule. It shows the relationship between quantity demanded and price. So at a price of $2, folks are willing to buy 7.1 billion pounds of cotton. $1.75, 7.5 billion pounds, and so on and so forth. As the price goes down, the quantity demanded increases. If we plot these points and we connect them, then we wind up with the demand curve. And of course, it's made up of all the points in between these, not just those points. Between these price quantity combinations, there's all sorts in between as well. So as price falls, the quantity demanded rises, which again reflects the law of demand. All right, so we always emphasize this distinction in these econ courses because it's important to be able to sort of describe what's actually happening. So anytime we're talking about a change in demand, we're talking about a shift of the entire relationship between price and quantity. So that means that let's say that at $1, people were willing to buy 10 units of whatever, let's say iPhones, that in China in like 1875 when there were no iPhones. But anyway, they're $1 and people demanding 10. But let's say all of a sudden, people's incomes go up in general in the economy. Like everybody's a little bit richer for whatever reason. And so therefore, at any given price, be it $1 or any other price, people will buy more. So before they were willing to buy 10 at $1, now they're willing to buy 15 at $1. That occurs throughout the entire curve, so that shifts the entire curve. So that's what we call an increase in demand. Whenever the curve shifts to the right, it's an increase in demand. Whenever the curve shifts to the left, it's a decrease in demand. Now that's different than when we say a change in quantity demanded. Now, the curve itself is a relationship between the quantity demanded and the prices, right? We plotted those. That's what the curve represents, that very specific relationship. And therefore, anytime the price changes, then you're just going to move along that relationship. So if the price goes up, then people are going to buy less. So you're just going to move up the curve and vice versa. If the price goes down, people are going to buy more and you're just going to move down the curve. And when that happens, we say there's a change in quantity demanded. So again, the shift of the demand curve is a change in the quantity demanded at any given price, represented by the shift of the original demand curve to a new position. But if we're moving along the curve, because the thing affecting the change is just the price, which again is what the curve is capturing, the relationship between price and quantity demanded, then we're just talking about a change in quantity demanded. And that's a movement along the demand curve, a change in the quantity demanded of the good arising from a change in the good's price. Change in quantity demanded versus a change in demand, an important distinction. So a decrease in demand is a leftward shift of the curve. So again, if this is our demand curve at $2, people were willing to buy 7, and now they're not willing to buy any, apparently, at that same price. So at any given price, at any given quantity, they're only willing to buy that same quantity at a lower price. At any given price, they are willing to buy less. So that's just two ways of looking at the same thing. In the end, it is just a shift of the curve, and that is a decrease in demand. And an increase in demand is a rightward shift. And again, you can look at it the same way. So at $1 before, they were willing to buy 10. Now they're willing to buy 15. Or for 10 units before, folks were only willing to pay $1, but now they're willing to pay $2. All right, so understanding these shifts, what causes these shifts? Well, there's only a few things that generally cause shifts in the curve. The principal factors that change demand for any good are changes in the prices of related goods. So, if you're buying peanut butter, jelly is generally a related good to that in the United States. Peanut butter and jelly are bought together generally. Another thing that can affect demand, the demand curve, shifting the entire relationship between price and quantity, is changes in income. People have more money, or people have less money in general. Another thing is changes in taste. Another thing is changes in expectations. And another thing is changes in the number of consumers. We'll talk about each of these in turn right now. So in contrast to the effect of just the price, which only changes the quantity demanded, a change in any of these other factors will change the demand. So let's talk about the first one, changes in the price of related goods or services. There's two different types of potential related goods or services. One type is a substitute. So two goods are substitutes if the rise in the price of one good leads to an increase in the demand for another good. So let's say we're talking about cola, right? Pepsi and Coca-Cola. So you generally love cola and you don't care which brand you buy, but you'll buy the one that's cheaper, right? So let's say currently you're buying Coca-Cola. All of a sudden the price of Pepsi has gone down. That means that Pepsi is now cheaper than Coca-Cola. So you're going to substitute away from Coca-Cola. So you're going to consume less Coca-Cola and more Pepsi. If the price of Coca-Cola goes up, if the price of Coca-Cola goes down, then you're going to do the opposite. You're going to buy more Coca-Cola and you're going to buy less Pepsi. They're substitutes in consumption. So substitutes are usually goods that in some way serve a similar function: coffee and tea, muffins and donuts, train rides, and air flights. A rise in the price of the alternative good induces some consumers to purchase the original good instead of it, shifting demand for the original good to the right. So We'll look at examples eventually of that. Sometimes a rise in the price of one good makes consumers less willing to buy another good. So sometimes the goods aren't substitutes for each other, but they are what we call complements. So two goods are complements if a rise in the price of one good leads to a decrease in the demand for the other good. So again, peanut butter and jelly, generally bought together in the United States. For those of you that aren't from here, we love peanut butter and jelly together. It's just a thing. So if the price of any of them go up, then we're generally going to, of course, buy less of that good. So if we're buying peanut butter, the price of peanut butter goes up. We're going to buy less peanut butter. But because we always eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and that's the only way we eat peanut butter, we're going to buy less jelly as well. So if the price of peanut butter goes up, the quantity demanded of jelly will go down. So complements are usually goods that in some sense are consumed together. Computer and software, cappuccinos and cookies, cars and gasoline are other examples. Because consumers like to consume a good and its complement together, when the price of one good rises, the demand for its complement decreases, shifting the demand curve for the complement to the left. A second ago, I said that the quantity demanded changed for jelly. I actually meant the demand went down for jelly because the entire curve shifted. At any given price, for jelly, people were buying less because the price of peanut butter went up. All right, changes in income. So income, again, is another one of these factors that affects overall demand for a good. So the effect of changes in income on demand depend on the nature of the good in question. So the good in question could take one of two forms. One good is a normal good. Demand increases when income increases and vice versa. So let's say all of a sudden you guys get out of college and you have some decent jobs with some decent income. Your income goes up. You're going to buy more like, filet mignon or like really high quality meat or maybe high quality vegan food if that's your thing. Whatever it is of the quality that you're looking for, you're going to be able to buy more of that quality item because you have more money. The other type of good is an inferior good, and demand decreases when incomes increase and vice versa. So you're buying like really cheap frozen dinners with like some weird steak like thing in there that's been frozen for decades likely and is still consumable. You're buying it because you don't have much income because you're in college. It's understandable, but as soon as you're out of college and you get a job and you get some income, you're going to buy less of this type of food, frozen foods or generic brand hot dogs or things of that sort. So that is an inferior good. Now, the term inferior doesn't necessarily mean that the good is inherently inferior. It's just subjective. It's what you think of it as being. And for you, it could be normal or it could be inferior. It just depends on your tastes. All right, so again, we're talking about things that shift the entire demand relationship. Another one is a change in taste. So tastes and preferences are subjective and vary amongst consumers. Economists usually lump together changes in demand due to maybe fads or beliefs, cultural shifts, and so on under the heading of changes in taste or preferences. So over the last couple of decades, like things have changed with respect to like people's attitudes towards riding a bike or some other type of like transportation that isn't a car, that doesn't depend on like fossil fuels. So there's been a change in taste overall for bicycles. That means that at any given price, people were willing to buy more bicycles this decade versus like a couple of decades before because tastes changed. And that shifted the entire demand relationship. So that's what we're talking about here. When tastes change in favor of a good, more people want to buy it at any given price, so the demand curve shifts to the right. When tastes change against a good, fewer people want to buy it at any given price, so the demand curve shifts to the left. All right, let's talk about changes in expectations. So how we feel about how the future might look and affect us is going to affect our behavior today. So if consumers have a choice about the timing of a purchase, they buy according to what they expect will happen in terms of price. So buyers adjust current spending in anticipation of the direction of future prices in order to obtain the lowest possible price. So based on some stories in the news that maybe Volkswagen is having some issues and you love Volkswagens and you've been thinking of getting one, a brand new one, and you know that because they're dealing with a lot of legal issues and they're trying to resolve a lot of stuff that they're incurring a lot more costs, that means that their prices are likely going to be higher within the next 2 years. So as soon as you hear about that, that's going to change your expectations about how much the car is going to cost in the future, which means that you're going to then want to buy it today versus waiting for the future. So if that happens to everybody in the market, then at any given price, folks are willing to buy more, and that will shift the entire demand curve to the right, and vice versa. Another important factor is the population size, so the change in the number of consumers. So as the population of an economy changes, the number of buyers of a particular good also changes, thereby changing the demand. Like post-World War II, we had the baby boom generation, right? People were making a lot of new people because a lot of people died during the wars, which is sad. But yeah, there was a good time had after that. And then that population grew up. And then you had a lot more people like 20 years later wanting to go to college, right? And so then at any given price, people were willing to consume more like college education, right? The population and therefore the demand for education increased as a result of the baby boom. And then you can continue to track that the baby boom generation is about to retire, and so then the demand for like certain prescription drugs that older people tend to take is going to increase, because that population is now going to enter that market in a way that's going to severely change demand. All right, so let's talk about the distinction between individual and market demand curves. So an individual demand curve represents illustrates the relationship between quantity demanded and price for an individual consumer. So you and I will each have individual demand curves for a particular product. The market demand curve shows how the combined quantity demanded of all the consumers depends on the market price of the good. Generally, when economists refer to the demand curve, whenever we say the demand curve, we're talking about the market demand curve. So let's say you have a person named Darla, and we're talking about the market for blue jeans, and this is her individual demand for blue jeans. At $2, she's willing to buy 20 pairs. At $1, she's willing to buy 30 pairs. And then you've got this guy named Dino. He's also in the market for blue jeans. This is his individual demand for blue jeans. At $2, he's willing to buy 10. At $1, he's willing to buy 20. So how we combine these individual demands into market demands is we do what's called horizontal summation across prices. So at $2, we look at how many Darla's willing to buy. She's willing to buy 20. At $2, we see how many Dino's willing to buy. He's willing to buy 10. So therefore, the market demand made up of these two individuals, they are now the market. At $2, the market demand is going to be 30, just the sum of their individual demands. And then we do that across all prices to get from individual demand to the market demand. So again, it's the horizontal sum of the individual demand curves of all consumers in that market. All right, so that's the demand side. Let's talk about the supply side, the other side of the market, the sellers, right? Any of us could eventually be sellers, suppliers. So there is some intuition that you could learn from this and also maybe inject into it if you already have had some experience. But like any other model in economics in this class or beyond, or even in other courses that use models, it's always a good idea to put yourself inside of that model, depending on what part of that model you're looking at. So in this case, we're talking about the supply side, so you kind of want to think like a supplier. Okay, I'm a supplier. I'm trying to make as much money as possible in the market, and I'm trying to lower my costs as much as possible in order to have the most profit. So supply represents the behavior of sellers. So the supply curve shows the quantity supplied at various prices. Now the quantity supplied is the actual amount of a good or service people are willing to sell at some specific price. And much like the demand schedule, the supply schedule shows how much of a good or service would be supplied at different prices. So again, you've got maybe like a supply schedule like you see here, where you've got, let's say the price of cotton is $2. At $2, 11.6 billion pounds of cotton are willing to be supplied in the market. As the price goes down, we see that the amount that sellers are willing to supply is going down as well. And so that then is the opposite of what we saw with the demand relationship, which again reflected the law of demand. So in this case, this schedule can map out the supply curve, which is an upward sloping, meaning it has a positive slope, unlike the demand curve that had a negative slope. And the positive slope, again, just represents the fact that the quantity of cotton, which is on the x-axis, as it is increased, then the dependent variable, the price in this case, is increasing as well. So that's what a positive slope means that both of the variables are moving in the same direction, whereas a negative slope means that the variables are moving in opposite directions, like we saw with quantity demanded. As the price went down, quantity demanded went up, and vice versa. So again, this represents the law of supply. A higher price for a good or service, other things equal, leads suppliers to supply a greater quantity of that good or service. I spelled supply wrong, sorry about that. Movement along the supply curve is much like a movement along the demand curve. So that's a change in the quantity supplied of a good arising from a change in the good's price, again, because we're talking about the curve representing the relationship between price and how much sellers are willing to sell. That's what the curve is. That's what it embodies. So whenever the price is changing, we're going to move along it. If something else is affecting supply, then we're going to shift the entire curve. So the shift of the supply curve is a change in the quantity supplied of a good or service at any given price. It's represented by the change of the original supply curve to a new position. So this is just a movement along the supply curve. If the price of coffee beans, let's say, goes up, then suppliers just supply more along their supply curve. And that is not the same thing as a shift of the supply curve. So again, when we're talking about, let's say, a movement along, we're talking about an increase in quantity supplied. And we're talking about a shift in the supply curve, let's say to the right, where at any given price, suppliers are willing to supply more. We're talking about an increase in supply, not an increase in quantity supplied. So an increase in supply, again, is a shift to the right. A decrease in supply is a shift to the left. So let's talk about what shifts the supply curve. There's a few general factors we can pin down, much like on the demand side. So economists believe that the shifts of the supply curve for a good or service are mainly the result of 5 factors, though as with demand, there are other possible causes. So one is changes in input prices, how much it costs me to produce the good I'm producing. Changes in the price of related goods or services will also affect how much a supplier is willing to supply. Changes in technology that affect my costs as well, how much I'm able to produce at any given small increment of time. Changes in expectations about what may happen in the future, just like on the demand side, where you might expect the price to go up or down in the future, so that'll change your behavior today. And changes in the number of producers, so the population of producers in this case, rather than the population of consumers. So the first one, changes in input prices. An input is a good or service that is used to produce another good or service. So an input can be, like a car engine for a car. It can be steel for a car engine. An increase in the price of an input makes the production of the final good more costly for those who produce it and sell it. So if, let's say, and another input into production is like labor. So if the wages of your workers have gone up, that means now it costs you more per unit of output to produce. That means that at any given price, you're going to supply less, because at the old price, your costs were lower and now your costs are higher. So you need to supply either less or you need to charge more at that same quantity. Another thing that could affect supply, meaning increase or decrease supply, is changes in the price of related goods or services. So inputs used in production have opportunity costs. Sellers will choose to use inputs whose profit is the highest. So let's say a single producer sometimes produces a mix of goods rather than a single product. So you might have a producer that produces oil, but they can also produce natural gas, because both oil and natural gas can be found in the same places, and generally, and also the same technology can be used to extract both. So there are substitutes and complements in the production process. So an oil refiner will supply less gasoline at any given price when the price of, let's say, heating oil rises, shifting the supply for gasoline to the left. So I'm able to supply gasoline and heating oil. Heating oil is going for more money in the market, and so then I'm going to substitute away from producing oil to more heating oil by rededicating my machines to just heating oil. And that means in the market for gasoline at any given price, the supplier is going to supply less. So the supply curve for gas will shift to the left. So it'll supply more gasoline at any given price when the price of heating oils fall, and shifting the supply curve for gasoline to the right. As I said, this means that gasoline and other co-produced oil products are substitutes in production for refiners. In contrast, due to the nature of the production process, other goods can be complements in production. Producers of natural gas often find that natural gas wells also produce oil as a product of extraction, as I mentioned. All right, so the higher the price at which maybe a driller can sell its oil, the more willing it will be to drill natural gas wells, and more natural gas, and the more natural gas it'll supply at any given price. So again, those are complements in production. By producing one, you can produce the other one. And so if you can make more money from one in the market and you're going to produce more of that one, you just happen to also be producing more of the other one. So they're complements in production. So therefore, for natural gas, whenever you are going to sell more in oil, natural gas at any given price, you'll supply more, so the supply curve will shift to the right. Higher oil prices lead to more natural gas supply at any given price because oil and natural gas can be tapped simultaneously. As a result, oil is a complement to the production of natural gas. The reverse is also true. Natural gas is a complement to the production of oil. So if you're kind of lost on these things, or you feel like it's going too fast, I'm recording it so you can go back to it. But the textbook, you got to read the textbook. The textbook will help you as well. The homework problems will cover some of these issues. I've already done the homework for 2, so you can listen to me explain all the problems, and that'll give you some more insights into them as well. All right, changes in technology. So again, new, better technologies make sellers more willing to offer the good that they're selling at any given price, or sell their quantity at a lower price. So like I said earlier, with the cotton gin, where people were picking cotton, and that just took forever. But the cotton gin was then introduced, which allowed a lot more cotton to be picked within an hour's time period. That means that the seller can now sell a lot more cotton at a lower price. So the cotton gin caused the supply curve for cotton to increase, meaning that it shifted to the right at any given price. The sellers were willing to sell more cotton. So again, a technological innovation lowers costs and increases supply. All right, another important factor that shifts supply is changes in expectations. Much like on the demand side, where maybe I expect prices to change in the future, maybe go higher, so I'll buy more in the present. The expectation of a higher price for a good in the future decreases current supply of the good if they can store the good, and vice versa. So if they're selling something that's not like food that will, eventually rot, whatever it is, a car or anything that can be stored in a warehouse, if you know that in the future the price will be higher for whatever reason, then as a seller, you're going to want to sell less today and more in the future. So today, if you know the price is going to be higher, the supply curve will shift to the left, meaning that at any given price, folks are going to be supplying less. So consider the fact that gasoline and other oil products are often stored for significant periods of time at oil refineries before being sold to consumers in silos, as you see here. Knowing that the demand for gasoline peaks in the summer, oil refiners normally store some of their gasoline produced during the spring for summer sale. Similarly, knowing that the demand for heating oil peaks in the winter, they normally store some of their heating oil produced during the fall for winter sale because they can sell it for higher prices during the winter. And finally, the change in the number of producers. So as producers enter and exit a market, the overall supply changes. So if there's a market where profits are to be made, because there's a lot of people buying the goods and there aren't enough sellers, then other sellers are going to enter that market. That means that at any given price, that suppliers are going to be willing to supply more. That will shift the supply curve to the right. As they enter the market, the overall supply changes. All right, so again, let's talk about this individual versus the market supply curve. So again, we do the exact same thing we did before with the individual demands to aggregate, combine the demand into the market demand. So here you've got Mr. Silva, who's selling cotton for $2. He's willing to sell, or this is coffee actually, or price of cotton and quantity of coffee. Okay, something's weird here, but let's just say it's cotton. So Mr. Silva's individual supply curve for cotton at $2 is willing to supply 3 pounds, let's say. Mr. Liu is willing to supply 2 pounds for $2. That means that in the market, if we do a horizontal summation across prices, at $2, the market supply will be 5, which is the sum of 3 plus 2. So that's how we aggregate, combine individual supply into market supply. Obviously, you have a lot more people involved, a lot more sellers, and the numbers are bigger, but the method is the same. So the market supply curve shows how the combined total quantity supplied by all individual producers in the market depends on the market price of that good. All right, now finally, let's put everything together, supply and demand, and get to an equilibrium, which is what all markets are always trying to get to, this equilibrium where the amount of opportunities to make people better off are used up. So we've covered the first 3 key elements in the supply and demand model, the demand curve, the supply curve, and the set of factors that shift each of these curves. So in Chapter 1, we learned the general principle that markets move toward equilibrium, a situation in which no individual would be better off taking a different action. So a competitive market is in equilibrium when the price has moved to a level which the quantity of a good demanded equals the quantity of the good supplied. Price has moved to a level that exactly matches the quantity demanded by consumers to the quantity supplied by sellers. So the equilibrium price, also known as the market clearing price, is a price that matches quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. The equilibrium quantity is the quantity bought and sold at that equilibrium price. So here we have an example of a market with a demand curve. It's downward sloping, reflecting the law of demand. As price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, and vice versa. So as the price goes up, here's a price of $50, 50 cents. We got a lot of demand here, but as the price goes up to, let's say, $1.75, we got demand becoming a lot less than 13, close to 7 there. And then the upward sloping supply curve representing the law of supply, in which as the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. All right, so the easiest way to determine the equilibrium price and quantity in a market is by putting these 2 curves together on the same graph. So the price at which the 2 curves cross is the equilibrium price. So that point where they meet is the equilibrium for the market, and it again reflects the price-quantity combination that equilibrates the market. So we've got the equilibrium price. And we can be sure the market will arrive at the equilibrium price by answering the following 3 simple questions. Why do all sales and purchases in a market take place at the same price? So there are some markets where the same good can sell for many different prices, depending on who's selling and who is buying. So you could be on vacation and you could buy a souvenir in some tourist trap, and then you could see the same item maybe somewhere else, perhaps even in the shop next door for a lower price. So tourists don't know which shops offer the best deals and don't have time for comparison shopping. Thus, sellers in tourist areas can charge different prices for the same good. Now, in any market where the buyers and sellers have both been around for some time, sales and purchases tend to converge at a generally uniform price, so we can safely talk about the market price. So if you're not a bunch of foreigners trying to figure out where to buy stuff, and you just have an idea of where everything's sold, then obviously nobody can get away with charging a higher price because nobody would buy from them. They'd just go over to the seller that has the lower price. So the second question is, why does the price fall if it's above the equilibrium price? So this is the equilibrium. If the price is anywhere above it, then we're going to be in a situation that's called a surplus. And that's when the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. Surpluses occur when the price is above the equilibrium level. So let's say at a price of $1.50, the quantity demanded, if we just go to the demand curve, is going to be 8.1 billions of pounds of cotton, let's say in this case. At that same price, the suppliers are willing to supply quite a bit more than is being demanded, which is, in this case, 11.2 billion pounds of cotton, which obviously is significantly more than 8.1, which is quantity supply, which means there's going to be extra, right? There's going to be what we call the surplus. So that difference between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied at the price that's above the equilibrium is the surplus. Yeah, it's 2.1. So the surplus offers an incentive for those frustrated would-be sellers to offer a lower price in order to poach business from other producers and entice more consumers to buy, right? So you've got sellers over here that are like, well, I've got a lot of inventory on my hands. I don't want to just get stuck with it, so I'm going to start undercutting my competitors, and they'll start bidding the price down. And so that will eventually get the price down to the equilibrium point. So again, the result of this price cutting will be to push the prevailing price down until it reaches the equilibrium price. The price of the good will fall whenever there's a surplus. That is, whenever the market price is above its equilibrium level. So the third question asked is, why does the market price rise if it's below the equilibrium price? So in that case, we have what's called a shortage. When the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied, shortages occur whenever the price is below the equilibrium level. So when there's a shortage, there are frustrated would-be buyers, people who want to purchase, but they can't find sellers that are willing to supply. In this situation, either buyers will offer more than the prevailing price, so they'll start to compete against each other for the small amount of goods that are available. They'll start to bid each other out of the market, and they'll realize, and this will be realized in a higher price that will be charged by the seller. So either way, the result is to drive the prevailing price up. And so this bidding up of the prices happens whenever there are shortages, and there will be shortages whenever the price is below the equilibrium level. So the market price will always rise if it's below the equilibrium level. So again, we are talking about a shortage. So you've got a price, let's say, of 75 cents. Now the equilibrium price is $1. That's the price that will equilibrate the market, where the market will be at rest and nobody will want to change. Nobody's going to try to outbid anyone. It's like everybody's happy as they possibly can be. But let's say the price were 75 cents. At 75 cents, suppliers are only willing to supply 9.1 billion pounds of cotton, whereas people are willing to buy quite a bit more because it's a lot cheaper than the equilibrium price. So people are willing to buy 11.5. So obviously there's a lot more demand than there is supply, so you got a shortage. Again, when there's a shortage, there are frustrated would-be buyers, and I've already gone through this. All right. Let's talk about changes in supply and demand. So we talked about the things that shift each of these curves. We've put the two curves together to establish the equilibrium for the market, which is ultimately called the market clearing price and quantity, which is the prices that you normally see anytime you go buy something. Those are the market clearing prices. The market forces have driven the price to its equilibrium point, and the amount transacted is that equilibrium quantity. But let's talk about when forces cause either supply or demand to shift. One of these 5 to 6 factors that affect each of the sides of the market that I talked about. Let's talk about how that affects the overall equilibrium in the market. So let's talk about what happens when the demand curve shifts. So here we have a market again for cotton, downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. There's the equilibrium price, there's the equilibrium quantity. So let's say there's an increase in demand indicated by the rightward shift of the demand curve from D1, this original demand curve, to D2. So this is where we're ending up. Let's say income has changed again, and people have more money all of a sudden. Maybe the government has given out some sort of something like a refund from taxes for whatever reason, and now everybody has a little bit more money, and so at any given price, people are willing to buy more cotton, let's say. So that shifted the demand curve to the right. So at the original price, P1, this market is no longer in equilibrium. So if this is the new equilibrium, at this price, you've got, at the supply curve, you've got this much that's being supplied, but then you've got demand over here that's exceeding supply, right? So you're going to have a shortage. That means that there isn't going to be enough to go around for the people that want to buy. That means they're going to start competing against each other. I'm willing to pay a little bit more. No, I'll pay a little more than her. I'll pay a little more than him. And that will get the price up to this new equilibrium level. So the price rises and generates an increase in the quantity supplied and upward movement along the supply curve. So what's happened here is that demand increased, right? Because let's say incomes went up. So demand increased. That shifted the demand curve, and that caused a movement along the supply curve. So therefore, supply increased, quantity supply increased. So that's, again, emphasizing that distinction between an increase in supply versus an increase in quantity supplied. So when you're moving along the curve like we're doing here, we get an increase in quantity supplied due to an increase in demand, which was a shift of the demand curve. So the price rises and generates an increase in the quantity supplied and upward movement along the supply curve. This sequence of events reflects a general principle. When demand for a good or service increases, the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity of the good both rise. So we saw that demand increased. That means it shifted to the right. That means the equilibrium price, which was originally here, has gone up. And so has the equilibrium quantity, which was originally Q1. Now it's gone up to Q2. So again, that's a general principle that this captures, which is that demand increases, both equilibrium price and quantity increase, and vice versa. And that's what this says. Also, when demand for a good or service decreases, the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity of the good or service both drop. So let's look at the other side of the market and see what happens when the supply curve shifts, when supply either increases or decreases, and what kind of effect that has on equilibrium in the market. So the original equilibrium at here, E1, in this particular setup, where we have this downward sloping demand and upward sloping supply with a corresponding equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So what's going to happen in this problem is that there's going to be a decrease in supply. So let's say that, again, we're talking about cotton. So wages have gone up for cotton workers, and now suppliers are only willing to supply less than they were before at any given price because it's now more expensive to them for them to produce a pound of cotton or whatever. So supply decreases. This was the old equilibrium. Supply has decreased, and now we see that at the old price, that is below the new equilibrium price. So again, at that old price, then you are going to have an excess demand, and then again, that's going to bid up the price to the new equilibrium. So in this case, because demand decreased, that caused us to move along our demand curve, and so then the quantity demanded increased. So we moved along the demand curve, so that was that led to I'm sorry, this is a decrease of quantity demand. I apologize for that. We're moving in this direction. So initially this was the equilibrium quantity, and that caused us to move to this new equilibrium quantity, which is less than the old one, and therefore the quantity demanded has decreased. But what's important is that distinction between a decrease in demand versus a decrease in quantity demanded, and that's just always something to keep in mind in this course and your other econ courses and anytime you're dealing with econ, because again, you can easily mix up the two descriptions, which will then muddy the waters of understanding exactly what you're talking about. So in economics, oftentimes, because we talk very abstractly about these things, like we're going to talk about a lot of different things that are similar, and you just need ways of differentiating them, and you need to be very in tune with how we're defining those differences, or else nobody understands what anybody's talking about. All right, so at the original price, as I said, a shortage exists because there's excess demand and the market is no longer in equilibrium, and that causes the price to rise. And so we get a new higher equilibrium price, but a lower equilibrium quantity in the market that's being transacted. All right, so in the new equilibrium, the price is higher and the equilibrium quantity is lower than before. This can be stated as a general principle. When the supply of a good or service decreases, the equilibrium price of the good or service will increase, and the equilibrium quantity of the good or service will decrease. So that's just a general principle. Now, for me, I like to just always just kind of like picture this model either in my head or draw it for myself, and just kind of, if I'm told that something's changing, kind of like just change it in the model and then let the results just speak for themselves. But you can memorize general principles as well. Both ways work. Whatever works for you to be able to sort of perform like a market analysis on this basic model. Which again is very powerful, like even in the managerial economics course that I teach, which is basically an intermediate microeconomics course that is meant to provide insights to like firm managers, like CEOs and these sorts of folks. Even in those courses, we talk about this exact same model in the exact same way because it's a very powerful model. It explains a lot, and it will always explain a lot for you anytime you're dealing in a market. That market will generally behave similarly to this model, and so you'll be able to gain some insights into what may happen in the model given things that may be happening outside of it, such as changes of prices of inputs or like changes in expectations of prices or whatever it is that we talked about, and even other things that may fall outside of that. You can still, understanding how the model works, kind of try to apply an effect that is happening to a market that you might be working in to be able to figure out, okay, what will happen, and then be able to figure out, well, what should I do in response to that. So again, powerful model, not just a thing that you learn in some class that you don't care about, maybe, I don't know. Powerful model, useful, something to take with you throughout your life. All right, let's talk about simultaneous shifts of supply and demand. Sometimes you're going to have both sides of the market changing. Sometimes it happens that both curves will change at the same time. This is not unusual in real life. Supply curves and demand curves for many goods and services shift quite often because the economic environment is continuously changing. So the resulting effect of the market is not as clear-cut as when only one curve shifts. When both curves shift, sometimes it's not necessarily clear what will happen. All right, so let's say initially we're at this equilibrium. Here's our equilibrium price. Here's our equilibrium quantity. Let's say that there's a large increase in demand. So again, maybe let's just talk about incomes. Incomes going up a lot, and people are now willing to buy more at any given price, so demand increases. So just with this one effect, we get to this new equilibrium with a higher equilibrium price and a higher equilibrium quantity, and our quantity supplied has gone up because we moved along the curve. Nothing has changed the position of that curve. Now, all of a sudden, at the same time, supply has decreased. Wages have gone up, whatever. So the supply curve has shifted to the left. In this case, because of how much we shifted the curves, we have resulted in a equilibrium quantity that's still greater than the one we had. So equilibrium quantity has increased. And in this case, the equilibrium price has also increased with these two effects on the market. Now, so in this case, the increase in demand dominates the increase in supply because of how much we shifted the demand curve. Now, another possible outcome is going to happen if we shift the curves slightly less than we had shifted them before, or in this case, shifted the supply curve a little bit more than before. So let's say the supply decreased a bit more than it had before, and the demand curve shifted to the right a little bit less than it had before. So again, going back to the last diagram, we saw that the equilibrium quantity had increased and the equilibrium price had increased when demand increased and supply decreased. In this next case, again, supply decreases and demand increases. But in this case, we get this new equilibrium here. So in this case, equilibrium price has gone up as well, much like before. So that effect is the same. So therefore, that effect is clear. But because of how much we shifted the curves in this case, the equilibrium quantity actually fell rather than increased. So that demonstrates that simultaneous moves in the curves can lead to ambiguous outcomes. We don't know what's going to happen to equilibrium quantity because we don't necessarily know how much each of the curves might shift. So that's just another thing to keep in mind, that although you can predict things with this model, you can also not predict things with this model. And ultimately in life, you would need actual numbers that would tell you the actual magnitude of these changes to be able to get any kind of concrete result of what may happen in a market. All right, so again, when demand increases and supply decreases, the actual quantity bought and sold can go either way depending on how much the demand and supply curves have shifted. All right, now let's just talk a little bit about like this concept of competitive markets versus others, like I mentioned in my opening statements about this chapter. Early in this chapter, we defined a competitive market and emphasized that the supply and demand framework is a model of a competitive market. To understand why competitive markets are different from other markets, let's compare the problems facing two individuals. Let's say you have a wheat farmer who must decide whether to grow more wheat, and the president of this company, Alcoa, which is a giant aluminum company. So for the wheat farmer, the question is simply whether the extra wheat can be sold at a price high enough to justify the extra production costs. The farmer need not worry about whether producing more wheat will affect the price of the wheat he or she was already planning to grow, because like I said, wheat is not something you can differentiate from other sellers. It's a very generic good. It's what's called a commodity, and nobody can really affect the price of it. None of the sellers, none of the buyers. There are thousands of wheat farmers, and no one farmer's decision will have any impact on the market price. For the Alcoa executive, things are not quite that simple because the aluminum market is not competitive. There are only a few big producers, including Alcoa, and each of them is well aware that its actions do have a noticeable impact on the market price. Alcoa can't decide whether or not to produce more aluminum just by asking whether the additional product will sell for more than it costs to make. The company also has to ask whether producing more aluminum will drive down the market price and reduce its profit. So when a market is competitive, individuals can base decisions on less complicated analysis than those used in a non-competitive market. This in turn means that it's easier for economists to build a model of competitive markets than that of a non-competitive market. So that's why this model can be easily introduced to you at the beginning of the semester, both in this class and in microeconomics. But that's why microeconomics is a more difficult course, because the analysis then becomes more complicated as you start to think about the complexities involved in a less competitive environment. What does that mean? How do you represent that graphically? What does that mean for cost? What does that mean for benefits? How does that affect the quantity I'm going to sell? It's a lot of these questions wind up getting complicated and difficult to answer. Anyway, we are done with this chapter, folks. Congratulations. You made it through the day. So that's 2 chapters. I will see you next week. Have a great week. I will open up homeworks, but they won't be due till the beginning of the 4th week. And if you're trying to get into the course, come up here, sign in.